Good afternoon. Welcome to today's Civic Scientist Lecture titled Evolution, COVID-19, and Communicating Controversial Science to the Public. Thanks for joining us online. My name is Kirsten Matthews, and I'm the Fellow for Science and Technology Policy at Rice University's Baker Institute for Public Policy. Before we begin, I want to thank our supporters that make our research and this event possible. Funding for this event, as well as our Science and Technology Policy Program and the Civic Scientist Lecture Series, were generously provided by a gift from Winifred and Benjamin Chang, as well as sponsorship from the Weiss School of Natural Sciences and the Brown School of Engineering at Rice University. In addition, our program received funding for this and other events focused on U.S. science competitiveness through grants from the Kavli Foundation and the National Science Foundation. I also like to thank our Baker Institute staff for their support on today's event, including Cecilia Zook, our event manager, and Daniel Morelli, the program manager for the Science and Technology Policy Program. Every week brings new scientific discoveries like the unearthing of new fossils or identification of the genome for new species. These discoveries help clarify some of the most important events in the history of life on Earth, but controversial topics such as evolution, climate change, and our responses to the current pandemic are often met with skepticism by a significant portion of the public, especially when science is used to develop public policy. Today, we will discuss strategies that we can implement as individuals or organizations to better convey the veracity and urgency of controversial subjects. To moderate this discussion is Dr. Scott Solomon. Dr. Solomon is an associate teaching professor in the Department of Biosciences at Rice University, as well as a research associate at the Smithsonian Institution's Natural Science Museum of Natural History. He is also the author of the public science book, Future Humans, Inside the Science of Our Continuing Evolution. Welcome, Dr. Solomon, to our discussion. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Kirsten. Good afternoon, everyone. So my name is Dr. Scott Solomon, and one of the courses that I co-teach here at Rice, along with my colleague, Dr. Lauren Kapsha, is a seminar course on public science communication. And the goal of this course is to provide undergraduate and graduate students with an appreciation for the various types of public science communication, its importance to society, and the techniques that are used in effective public science communication. To accomplish this, we invite professionals from a range of scientific fields who regularly communicate about science with general audiences in various ways. Today's event is a part of this seminar course. We're thrilled to be able to partner with the Baker Institute's Civic Scientist program to open this event up to a wider audience. As such, we're working to accomplish simultaneously two goals here today. One, to provide students taking the seminar course with an opportunity to learn about public science communication from a leading science communicator, and to provide a forum for a wider discussion about the role of science and science communication in our society and in public policy. With that in mind, let me briefly explain the format of today's event, and then I'll introduce our special guest. So in just a few moments, I'll begin by asking our guests some questions, many of which have been sent to us in advance by students enrolled in our seminar course. We would also like to invite everyone watching today to submit their own questions via the Q&A tool. And we'll try to get to as many of your questions as we can. So without further ado, let me introduce today's guest, Dr. Neil Shubin. Neil Shubin is the Robert R. Bensley Distinguished Service Professor of Organismal Biology and Anatomy at the University of Chicago. He has a bachelor's degree from Columbia University and a PhD in Organismic and Evolutionary Biology from Harvard. He was a Miller Fellow at the University of California at Berkeley before beginning a faculty position at the University of Chicago. Dr. Shubin's research seeks to understand the mechanisms behind the evolutionary origin of new anatomical features of animals. He's conducted fieldwork in the Canadian Arctic, Greenland, China, as well as in Antarctica and other locations as well. His research group also uses a range of laboratory approaches to understand the genetics, functional anatomy, development, and evolution of different groups of vertebrate animals. He is especially well known for the discovery, along with a team of collaborators, of a 375-million-year-old fossil known as Tiktaalik rosier, a type of transitional form between fish and land animals. Among his many awards and recognitions, Dr. Shubin is a fellow of the Guggenheim Memorial Foundation, a member of the National Academy of Sciences, the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, the American Philosophical Society, and the American Association for the Advancement of Science. Dr. Shubin is also an accomplished science communicator. He is the author of 3 books, Your Inner Fish, The Universe Within, and his most recent book, Some Assembly Required, which was published last year. He is also the host of an Emmy award-winning PBS miniseries called Your Inner Fish, which is based on his book of the same name. In recognition of his accomplishments in communicating science broadly, he has received the Distinguished Service Award from the National Association of Biology Teachers and the Science Communication Award from the National Academy of Sciences. Dr. Shubin, welcome, and thank you so much for being here.
Well, it's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So I want to start by asking how you first became interested in paleontology and evolution. Was this always something that you wanted to do?
No. I thought I wanted to be an astronomer or a veterinarian or a physician. I knew I liked science, but I didn't know what kind of science. So when I went to college, in my freshman year, I just took a random course on human evolution. Literally, just had a gap in my calendar, in my schedule, and just put my finger on it, and there was a human evolution course. And I took it, and it absolutely blew my mind. It was taught by a curator at the American Museum of Natural History. He'd come in each week with fossils, casts of fossils collected around the world, showing human origins. And I remember thinking, wow, people go out around the world to find physical objects, to find evidence of the origin of our species millions of years ago. You can actually do that for a living. It blew my mind. And then one thing led to another. I got invited on a field expedition later on and got the bug, and the rest is history, as they say.
So take us back to the discovery of Tiktaalik. What were the circumstances that led to this discovery? And for our audience that might not be familiar with this particular fossil, why was it so important?
Well, what I was interested in actually early on, since my graduate school days, was the transition from fish to land living animal. You think about this event. For most of the history of life, life was in the oceans, in the seas, for billions of years. Then about 375 million years ago, creatures our distant ancestors took their first steps on land. And we had known that this transition happened, that fish evolved to walk. But I remember thinking, when I was a graduate student, this is a first-class scientific problem. How did fish evolve to walk on land? You think of all the things that need to change. Anyway, so that was the question. So I was training to be a paleontologist. And at the time, and I wanted to find a fossil that was sort of intermediate between fish and land living animal. And so we set off around the world to find some great intermediates. And we used the tools of geology to find it. We predicted where we would find it based on where the right rocks would be exposed at the surface. That search took us back in the 1990s to the Canadian Arctic, where we spent 6 years looking for this thing. And on the 6th year, just as we were running out of funding, we found a creature, which I was to hold it in front of you. It's about 4 feet long. It has scales in its back and fins with fin webbing, has fish-like texture to its skull. But if you look at it, it has a neck, has a flat head with eyes on top like a crocodile. And when you crack it open the fin, what do you find? It has bones that correspond to our upper arm, forearm, even parts of our wrist and digits in a fish fin. And this creature also had lungs as well as gills. So it was a wonderful intermediate between life in water and life on land, a creature of about 375 million years ago. We now have a lot of specimens of it, about 20 specimens of it. People have discovered more different kinds of this creature around the world. So it's really been a phenomenal time for our branch of science.
It comes through a little bit in the mini series and in the book as well, particularly in Your Inner Fish. But what was that moment of discovery like? So you're holding in your hand for the first time this, as you say, important transitional fossil. What was it like for you?
Well, you have to set the stage a bit. We had been looking for 6 years for this thing with very little success. And so when I first saw it, I knew what we had because I saw the tip of the skull. And the tip of the skull was clearly a fish, but a flat-headed fish. So it was very much of the right kind of creature. I remember in 2014 when it was found, it was in July. We were up in the Canadian Arctic, about 700 miles from the North Pole. The weather was terrible. It was an awful day. My colleague who actually cracked the rock that exposed it, he said, "Hey, Neil, what's this?" Ran over and there I saw it. My first reaction was one of relief. It was like we'd spent 6 years. But then, just not only joy, but the joy of discovery, but the joy that there was more discovery to be made because the creature was still in the rock. So the next, it ushered in a new phase. That new phase was, okay, well, now we know we have a creature right at the cusp of this transition from life in water to life on land. But what does its fin look like? What does its body look like? Because it was still in the rock. So it took a few months home when we brought the thing back to from the Canadian Arctic home to see that. And so it was a whole range of emotions. One was relief, the other was joy, but the other is, man, we have a lot to discover still, which was really fun.
Another point that you make in the book and the miniseries is that, to a certain extent you had predicted some of the features that this fossil would have. And so I imagine that's one of the reasons why you were able to recognize it when you saw it sticking out, is like, oh, okay, this actually has some of these features. So how were you able to make those types of predictions about what types of features you expect a species that's never before been seen to have?
Well, we knew from other fossil discoveries that were around the turn of the previous century that there was a group of flat-headed fish that kind of looked like a lot like land-living animals. We didn't know what their fins looked like. We didn't know what their internal surfaces looked like, but we knew there was this group of flat-headed fish out there that had bones like arrows in the head. So it wasn't completely random that way. So what then we did is we decided to look at a particular kind of rock. We wanted to look at rock about 375 million years old because we figured that was the right time. That was when this transition happened, or right around there. We also wanted rocks that were formed in the right environment to hold these fossils. So we made two kinds of predictions. Prediction number one was that this creature almost certainly had a flat head, so we were looking for that. The other was what kind of rock to look in. So that's what carried us to the Canadian Arctic. We chose those rocks and we were looking for a flat-headed fish. And that's what we were joking about for 6 years. We're like, where's our flat-headed fish? We weren't finding our flat-headed fish. Then we found our flat-headed fish. It was great.
Definitely a lesson in perseverance there too, I think. So your focus is in understanding these major transitions in the history of life, like the transition from life in the water to life on land. How, in general, can studying the history of evolution help us understand the way that evolution is playing out today?
Yeah, so what you can see when you look at the world around us, creatures are evolving, right? It's not just animals, but it's plants, it's organisms, it's viruses, it's microbes. We see the effects of evolution around us in our daily lives. In fact, we're living in COVID-19 with the consequences of evolution, not only of SARS-CoV-2, the virus, but all of its variants that are appearing, that appear under the right circumstances. So understanding the mechanisms of evolution can tell us so much about our modern world, not only about how it was made, but how it may change. We're living in an era of climate change. Climate change is happening around us. Species are changing as a result of that, their distributions, their bodies, and so forth. So we're seeing that. We're witnessing evolution in the creatures we live with, either in agriculture or the creatures that are pathogens, microbial pests, and so forth. So evolution is all around us. So the more we can understand its mechanisms, the more we can understand not only our place in nature, which has tremendous aesthetic value, but also understanding, what our world's likely going to look like in the coming years.
So you brought up the variants in the novel coronavirus that we know are in some cases more transmissible or more contagious. And so, yeah, I mean, when I'm teaching my students introductory biology, we're talking about evolution, it's impossible not to make that connection, right? That this is how evolution happens. There's a mutation, and sometimes those mutations are beneficial, and then those are favored by selection. I'm always struck by how, when it's portrayed in the media, those connections with evolution aren't always made explicit, right? So, I wonder what your thoughts on that. Like, do you think that it would be helpful if it was made more clear that when we're talking about variants here, this is actually an evolutionary process?
Absolutely. I mean, what we're seeing is in certain kinds of settings, certain mutations are more successful than others. That's classic natural selection acting, only it's acting in our bodies around us. And that's what we see. In certain settings, the viral strains are more transmissible, or mutations may accumulate in certain ways within certain kinds of individuals over time. So what you have is a setting, where evolution, both the environment as well as the genetic changes to creatures are causing these, these variants to arise and proliferate, in different places around the world. So it's a textbook case of evolution. I certainly wish people would pull it in, but it does. I mean, there are certain places where you will see that. And it's almost inescapable. You're not seeing new strains appearing in South Korea and Vietnam and Singapore, which have controlled the virus. You're seeing in other places which have not.
So at what point in your career did communicating science, especially, to a general audience, to not necessarily communicating just to other scientists, but at what point did that become a priority for you?
Well, my dad was a fiction writer, and he always used to say, "Hey, Neil, you've got to write a book. You got to communicate. Don't just talk to the in crowd. Talk to other people." And I'm like, "Sure, Dad, sure, or whatever." And so, I set off to write a textbook in comparative anatomy, super esoteric. It's an advanced undergraduate, and I was really into writing this comparative anatomy textbook, which is essentially evolution. And then one day I just realized, does the world need another comparative anatomy textbook? Because I was looking around, there's some really great ones out there, and I wasn't entirely confident I could do better than the ones that existed, right? But I was like, what if I wrote that book for the general public? Because there are wonderful stories, like the bones in our ears were the jaws of reptiles. And then things like when I would tell people the stories of comparative anatomy, which was going to be in my esoteric textbook, the general public, I would blow their minds. So I said, "Oh, okay, I'm going to write a book for the general public on comparative anatomy, and I'm going to make it relevant to people. Call it Your Inner Fish. Don't make it about comparative anatomy. Make it about the deep history of our own bodies." So that was essentially the birth of that. And once I started, it gained a life of its own. So my dad was right.
Absolutely. So, I mentioned some of the awards that you've won in this, for your science communication efforts, and I'll note that my students were really impressed by the episode that they watched of the PBS series, and they were wondering how you got to be so good at science communication. So, did you get any formal training once you decided this was something that you wanted to do, or how did you go about figuring out how to write to that audience?
Well, I mean, it's kind of the lessons of paleontology to scientific communication. The way we found that fossil, Tiktaalik rosea, was failing and learning from our failures. That was what happened over 6 years, and that's what ultimately led to our success. The same thing was true, I think, with scientific communication. No, I didn't have a lot of mentoring. But that being said, I had worked with, in graduate school, people who were really fabulous scientific communicators. Stephen Jay Gould was there at the time, so I used to talk to Steve and others. So there were certain role models, but they weren't direct mentors. No, it was really more trying things and seeing what worked, and particularly when writing Inner Fish, I sat down and wrote the book, and I never wrote anything for a non-science crowd. I, up to that point, had written nothing but scientific papers, which were read by, my colleagues. And they had jargon and they have a specific way of doing it. And I remember when I first sat down at the computer to write Inner Fish, I'm like, there are no rules here. The only real rules are that you make it enjoyable for people to read, that they want to turn the page, and that they learn something about the field of interest. And so that was incredibly liberating to me. And so then I set off on a quest to find my own voice as a writer. And that was filled with trial and error, honestly. I just had to write things and see what worked and see what didn't, and I would take the things that worked. And over time, I was able to hone a style.
So when you were working on your Inner Fish, or perhaps in some of your more recent books, or your PBS series, who do you envision as your audience? Like when you're writing, who do you imagine that you're writing for?
Oh, that's easy. My dad, my late father. Because he was a writer and was very critical as a writer, but he wrote fiction, and he liked to think about writing page turners in fiction, but he was very intimidated by science. So it was a perfect sort of person to have in my mind, is to tell the stories to somebody like him, who had barriers to understanding science. He's a smart guy, but any amount of jargon would really turn him off. I'd have to unpacking the science meant explaining it to Dad, and not only unpacking the science, but importantly, coming up with narratives, with stories that would be compelling. having a father who writes fiction, that does set the bar pretty high when you're coming up with stories and writing. But that was the bar I set for myself when writing Inner Fish, and obviously I've done ever since.
Was he able to read any of your work?
Oh yeah, Inner Fish. He did a very detailed red ink of Inner Fish and did a detailed red ink of the second book. He unfortunately passed away before the third.
So one of the things that we wanted to make sure we talk about here is the notion that evolution is considered controversial, at least in society. When I'm teaching about evolution to my students, I try to emphasize that, even though we have this supposed controversy in society, there isn't really a controversy among scientists about whether evolution exists. We obviously debate about the specific details and things, but nevertheless, it's perceived as a controversial science. So what experiences have you had with people who maybe are skeptical of evolution, and what advice do you offer about how to interact with people that are skeptical, maybe of any type of science?
Yeah, so I mean, I run around the country telling people they're fish, right? That's what I do. And for Darwin Day, I'll go to Greensboro, South Carolina. I'll go to Oklahoma. I'll go into the Bible Belt and talk about your inner fish. And that's been a thing I've done up until the COVID, obviously, where I couldn't travel. When you think about opposition to evolution, it takes a couple forms, and this is sort of generic. There are people who are opposed to it simply because they haven't been exposed to it, and they think it's crazy. That fish would evolve to walk on land. Others are opposed to it because it conflicts greatly with their worldview. And their worldview may be due to religious factors, cultural ones, or what have you. And so there are different ways people come to a critique of science or evolution. And so the way the response I've had has been, let me just tell you, the strategy I use when I speak to audiences like that is to speak to them with respect as individuals. The worst thing you could possibly do if you're trying to change somebody's mind or introduce them to a new way of knowing is offend them. Offending somebody personally is a great way to shut them down. As they say, it's best to catch flies with honey, not vinegar. And so what I try to do when I speak about your inner fish is tell the story of the discovery of Tiktaalik, right? Which is loaded with human elements, where we'd go to the Arctic every year. There were polar bears up there. It was really challenging. We failed for 5.5 years before finding it. And just to tell that human story and then say, we made a prediction, here's how we tested it, and by the way, here's the fish, and I'd bring a cast of it. So the response I tend to get, when I give a talk, it tends to be self-selected, people who are, pro-evolution. But occasionally I have somebody who's skeptical. But the questions that I get tend to be much more, not that this is crazy, but more, well, how do you know how old it is? More specific queries. And those we can answer. Those are ones we can talk about. And if they disagree with those, there's nothing I can do, but I can show them, here's the data that we have. But the minute they're asking questions like that, they've already accepted part of my argument. Right? They've already accepted deep time. They've already accepted that, hey, this is a fish with arms, so you can't really say it doesn't have arms because I brought it with me. So that's how I do it. Stories, examples, and don't offend people. Treat them with respect.
Yeah, I think that's great advice. Yeah. So I want to, at this point, encourage all of those that are here and watching to submit any questions that you have for Dr. Shubin via the Q&A tool. And we will try to get to as many of your questions as we can. So while folks are thinking of their questions and entering them, I'll ask another one. I know that museums have played an important role in your career, as they have in mine. And I think I read somewhere that visiting museums was a part of what attracted you to science in the first place. So I'm curious about what role you think informal science education, like the type that is, that museums play a role in, what role does that play in communicating science to the public? And how does that role compare with the role of formal science education for our society?
Well, I got to tell you, two of the best experiences of my life was obviously being a young kid doing field trips to my local natural history museum or my local art museum. I used to love that, not only because we didn't go to class, that was great when you're young, right? Miss class for a day. But the other is I'd be in the presence of dinosaurs, or in the presence of Van Goghs, or in the presence of stuff that just blew my mind, right? So these objects, whether they're art or natural history, have a power to them. When I was at the Field Museum, I was provost at the Field Museum, so chief academic officer at the Field Museum, which is our natural history museum in Chicago. The first question people would ask when you'd see them in the dinosaur exhibits is, is this stuff real? And when you tell them it's real, their eyes would change. Now, it doesn't change a git. A high quality cast would look the same as the real bones, but the real bones have power. We respond to objects. Objects have a resonance, an emotional resonance to them. And I think that's the power of museums. When you have, there's a certain awe that comes when you stand under a dinosaur at a museum, or an exhibit, any sort of exhibit at a museum, where you have an object that really affects you inside deeply, either aesthetically or, in my case, intellectually. Because when I see a fossil, these are objects that people have traveled around the world to collect and brought them back, and that they change the way we see the natural world. They change the way we see our place in nature. They have a power to them. So there's something about that. So when I was at the museum, those were great days, because you would be doing education and science communication at every level. In a day, I'd be talking to 5-year-old kids. I'd be talking to high schoolers. I'd be talking to college students. I'd be talking to graduate students, postdocs, museum trustees, everything. And I was for when I was learning as a scientific communicator, having talking to those multiple groups at once, I think was really important. And that was when I was writing Inner Fish. And so what I was doing was I would test out what stories worked for these different groups. And it turns out the same stories sometimes did, like a Disney film. You could appeal to different crowds, albeit with some tweaks. So that was very powerful. And I think museums have a very important place in our society.
So we had a question in the Q&A. You were talking about the power of the original fossil, right? And how people's attitudes change when they realize that they're seeing an original fossil. So is the original Tiktaalik fossil at the Field Museum? Is that something that people can see?
Yeah, so the original fossil that we collected is the property of the Inuit people of Nunavut Territory, Canada. That was our deal with them. And we worked very closely with them as when we worked in the Canadian Arctic. So right now, the original fossils, there are 20 specimens. It was about a truckload of fossils when we drove them back a number of years ago. They're at the Canadian Museum of Nature, which is their equivalent of the Smithsonian Museum, the National Museum of Natural History. They're not on display yet. They bring them out for temporary displays, but they're not on a permanent display. They will be on permanent display ultimately up in the Inuit territory in Nunavut, up in Iqaluit, when they finish their their local museum.
Tell us a little bit about, as researchers, the value of seeing an original fossil, right? So as the member of the public, we get awed by being in the presence of something that's real. As a researcher, does it make a difference if you're working with a cast, another type of replica, or an original fossil?
It can, because there's much more detail to the original fossil than there is a cast. But there's one piece of technology that's changed everything for us. And that technology is high energy CT scanning, imaging, and computational power. What we can now do is we can take a fossil and pop it into a high energy CT scanner. I mean, these work at like 350 kilovolts. You don't want to be in that machine. This is to see through rock, right? Materials. And we can scan the fossils in great detail. Indeed, we could see them in a way we couldn't originally. We can see inside them. We could see the cellular structure. We could see interior structures that were hidden to us before, like blood vessels or surfaces and things that might hold nerves and things like that. So what we do now is, before we return the Tiktaalik specimens, we did high energy detailed CT scanning of every single one. So we have Tiktaalik on hard drives, and so now when we do our work on them, we use the digital data. Furthermore, we can print them out. We made all the data, as we publish it, we make all the data public. So, 3D models of Tiktaalik, you can download them and print them out in any size, in any color. That's the power of digital technology.
Right, those 3D printers have been a game changer for educators, for example, being able to have their own cast of important fossils like this. Right?
That's right.
So turning back to communication, we have a question about, do you think that literacy or education or perhaps science literacy plays a role when you're communicating with different audiences? Do you see that playing out, or do you adjust your strategies based on your perception of your audience?
That's a great question. There's parts I'll adjust and parts that I won't adjust. So if I'm talking about your inner fish to my colleagues, obviously, scientific colleagues, I can use certain terms and assume a certain background that I can't do when I'm speaking to the general public. But interestingly, sometimes I don't have to change the overall conceptual part of it. So the difference I'll use for speaking to different crowds is the language I'll use. So I will use no jargon whatsoever when I communicate to the general public. None, zero. In Your Inner Fish, the entire book is about a biological concept called homology. I didn't use the H word once in the book, yet the whole book's about it. I could show, don't tell it. Yet, if I was to write that book, and when I write papers for my scientific college, I use that word and other words as well. Jargon's a great way to turn people off if they're not, if they don't have background in your particular field. They'll struggle with the language, not the concepts. What I'm after are the concepts. However, when you remove jargon, right, all of a sudden it's hard because jargon's very precise. That's why we use it in science. So I have to find other ways to get that precision. But you have to do that. Otherwise, eyes will glaze over. So yes, I'll change some things, but not others.
So how did you make that transition from being trained and used to using jargon in your communication with your colleagues to be able to, communicate with people without slipping into the use of jargon?
So what I try to think about when I'm writing something for science, about science, is I try to think, what's the essential concept I want somebody to know? But after you're done this piece, what's my goal? What do I really want you to know? What do I consider it success on my part? And so what I'll do then is I'll try to find different ways to get there, right? And I'll experiment with that. I'll experiment with different kinds of stories to tell the tale of how we know that. I'll experiment with different kinds of analogies or metaphors that will enable me to give a vivid image in somebody's mind about something without all the jargon. So that's how I'll do it. I'll play with different things. I'll play with stories about discovery and the human element of the science, but I'll also play with analogies and metaphors that paint a picture in somebody's mind that might stay with them after they're done reading the piece.
Do you think there are good ways to assess how successful these efforts are? Like, how can you judge if you've achieved those goals?
Well, in the book world, it's sales to some extent, but more than that, I mean, that's a glib answer. I mean, I judge success by the kinds of questions I get from an audience. If I'm giving a talk on inner fish, for instance, I judge the success in that talk by the quality of the questions I receive. Now, maybe I'm speaking to different crowds, but you'd be surprised how, people from the ages of, 6 to 60 or 6 to 90, whatever, they can ask incredible questions. So when I get a great question, I consider that or if I get a challenging question, I'll consider that as a success, because that means somebody came in and really thought about it. And I'd like to take some credit that they were able to ask such a great question. So questions that people ask, and sometimes, when you get, the feedback that you get from people can come in many different ways, from comments and emails and things like that. I like to see, for me, it's successful if many different kinds of people find something that I wrote inspiring, of different kinds of backgrounds, whether scientific or cultural or religious or what have you. And for me, it's really, it's been really wonderful with Inner Fish is to see that, and to some extent the other books, but mostly Inner Fish, to see the way it's been adopted in middle schools and high schools and in colleges. And then I get, that's just that range is really powerful to me, because it meant that my goal, I was able to sort of achieve a goal, if you will.
So we have a question about your experiences of working as a team, right? So, today most science happens in teams of colleagues and collaborators. So tell us a little bit about your experiences of working with a team. How do you identify your team members, and how do you work together? And I'm thinking especially about, you were talking about spending multiple field seasons out in search of something that you hadn't yet found. How does the communication and interactions with your team members play out in a situation that I imagine is not always pleasant and could be really frustrating?
No, this is huge. This is part of the biggest thing I do for the field, is thinking about the team, right? So when you think about what I do, I work in Antarctica, where it could be minus 30 degrees and we're stuck in nylon tents, and we may be stuck in those tents for 3 or 4 days at a pop before we can work. I work in the Canadian Arctic, which is a little bit warmer, but it's wetter, which makes it challenging in its own way. These are all windy places. These are all places that are far from home. These are all places where, like in Antarctica, where I'm missing events. It's Christmas, it's New Year's, it's Thanksgiving. It's a variety of different holidays away from family and friends. So it can get downright challenging, and it can not only get challenging for me, it can get challenging for the 5 other people that I'm working with. So my rule of thumb is I take a small crew. 6 is the ideal number. 8 is a little bit harder. I try to take a crew where we don't need to have a camp manager. That is, 6 people can kind of manage themselves. I also take people that have a degree of self-sufficiency, which is key, particularly in a place like these places. I take people who can endure, who have good cheer, who have good senses of humor. There's nothing like a good sense of humor when you're stuck in a tent for long periods of time, or if you're stuck in an expedition where you're not finding much. It can be hard at the end of the day. If people have good cheer, but they are able to do a lot of work, it helps tons. So what I look for is people who are resilient. I look for people who know or can read the room in terms of how other people are feeling. There are times when you need to be with somebody else, and be sort of in their face to some extent. But there are other times when you need to be distant from them, and I need people who can see that. But there's a couple little tricks I have for in the field. One of the most important things, it's going to sound crazy, but one of the most important things for being in the field is having great food. I take great food. And the reason is, if we're stuck for 8 weeks in a place and we're not finding much and the weather's bad, if people can look forward to meals, it keeps attitudes high. So I like to tell stories in the field. I like to have group activities in the field, but also important to give people space, because people need space sometimes, and a lot of times in places like this. So people reading the room, people who have situational awareness about the safety, about each other, all these things you look for. And I know it when I see it. We've had really good luck. I've been leading expeditions in the Arctic, in the polar regions for 30 years. And I've been really fortunate with the people I've been able to work with. And it's the discovery we make there. It's not like Neil Shubin discovered Tiktaalik. No, it's a team of a lot of people who discovered Tiktaalik. And, it wasn't just one person. That's the other thing. It's real teamwork in getting the science done. And I like to take people who have different areas of expertise, whether it's geology or paleontology or physics, or maybe a mountaineer if it's really intense in terms of the ice and the crevasses and so forth.
So we've touched on this a bit already, but we have a few questions going back to the notion of controversial science. And I think people are also wondering about how do you connect people's skepticism about evolution to skepticism about things like climate change, and very relevantly now, vaccines. So in general, do you see any sort of general patterns about kind of what generates this skepticism that people have about different fields of science? And how do you talked about this a bit already, but how do you recommend people approach people that are being skeptical in other aspects of science?
Yeah, so there are a lot of reasons why people may be skeptical of science. The first is simply sometimes something looks kind of crazy to them, and their intuition runs different from what science says, and science is not intuition. Some people don't get that, but sometimes their intuition takes them a different direction. For a lot of people, it's also their culture, their local groups, their local families, local neighborhoods, local church groups, local political structures, and so forth, which have an enormous, our social structures, our social networks do a lot for us in terms of what we think is how we accept science as well as anything else. And then there are other things as well. I mean, there are religious backgrounds, there are cultural backgrounds, there are social backgrounds. All these things are part of this great social network those social networks that we have. So what are the techniques? So climate change, COVID-19, vaccine skepticism, evolution, genetically modified organisms, you name it. We can bundle a lot of these things in these categories. I think there's a couple things. You have to think about the message and you have to think about the messengers. So the message, I like to think, as I said earlier, that confronting people, telling them that they're making them feel small or stupid, or questioning people's motives, that's a great way to turn them off. Right now, sometimes that's true, and you have to confront it, but most of the times it's not. Most of the time, you have to enter it like with people in good faith. And I know that sounds strange to say at this day and age, but I think you have to treat people with great respect. If you don't treat people with respect, you're going to lose them. And the other is you have to engage them. You have to engage them with the data, but how the data is found, and that this is a human enterprise. And sometimes people struggle, particularly in the age of COVID, with our scientific facts. We don't, sometimes there's great uncertainty. You might have a study that shows one thing and a study that shows another thing. And what do you do in that case, right? So so we are experiencing science with COVID-19 in real time, in compressed real time. So that makes it a little bit more challenging for scientific communicators in that landscape. But the other thing is not just the message, but the messengers. Sometimes the expert's not the best messenger. When you think about evolution acceptance or COVID-19 vaccine acceptance and so forth, sometimes the best messenger is not the expert, is not Tony Fauci. It's a local preacher, it's a local political authority, it's a sports figure, it's a family figure, it's part of that's using that social network. So you have to think about not only the message, but also the ambassadors for that message. In some cases, it's not an expert like myself. It's somebody else, somebody within a social network. So somebody who may be more effective than me in communicating the importance of and the fact of evolution, to say somebody who's deeply religious may be a local preacher, not a local paleontologist. So you have to think about the message and the messenger. But when I'm the messenger, I tend to treat people with respect, try to bring a sense of humor, try to bring a lot of evidence to bear. But you have to be patient as well, because sometimes it can be very challenging personally when you're dealing with somebody who doesn't believe something you spent the last 40 years of your life on.
So that brings up a really interesting follow-up question, which is, you were talking about maybe the experts aren't always the best messengers, right? And so I want to ask you about more generally your thoughts about the role of scientists as science communicators, right? What do you see as the role of folks who are themselves researchers or scientists in terms of communicating science broadly?
Well, I think one of the things, for instance, when I bring the Tiktaalik story or the molecular biology stories that we work on, what I bring is a knowledge of the discovery. I can bring the story of discovery, how we know. How we know didn't arrive from outer space. It's something we work really hard to do, and what scientists around the world work really hard to do. And there are human stories in that, stories of deduction and discovery and intellect, but also failure and learning from failure, luck, serendipity, and other things. So to tell that story has a decidedly human side to it. So the more you can appeal to people's humanity, as well as appealing to their intellect and to show the evidence, because people can respond to evidence when done in the right way. Courts do this all the time. Legal system does all the time. We can do this, and I think science are uniquely able to do that in this, for evolution and climate change and others. And the other piece is, and this can't get lost, is there's something about inspiring people, right? It's not just the facts of science, it's how we do it and how cool it is and how amazing it is, and a sense of awe about this incredible world we live in, and here I'm cracking rocks in the Canadian Arctic, and there are polar bears, down the hill, and I'm pulling out a fish It's like a juxtaposition between present and past. And that fish is telling us how our distant ancestors learned to walk on land 375 million years ago. Every now and then I have to step back and say, whoa. But, to convey that sense of awe, I think is a very powerful thing. And that sort of is, if we can do that more effectively, I think we'll have a whole lot easier time communicating some of the harder things about science. So if we can inspire and engender a sense of awe, I think we can, that's part of the battle, and oftentimes an unappreciated one.
I couldn't agree more with that. Yeah. And so, with that in mind, I want to ask you a little bit about education, right? So you talked about you really didn't have a formal training in science communication. You learned to do it as you went, and you relied on what you knew from your father and what you were able to do just from your own experience. Do you think there's a role in communication training for scientists? Is that something that we should be trying to do, to train scientists to be able to communicate with the public?
Oh, absolutely. See, I don't think I didn't have training in communication. So I didn't take science communication. But when people ask me, what's the most important course I took in college? It wasn't paleontology. It wasn't genetics. It wasn't geology. It was Russian literature. And the reason why was because I had a complete stickler for writing in that course. And here I was reading Dostoevsky and Pushkin and Turgenev and Gogol and all these others. And I would have to write a paper a week to this person who would take it apart and tell me, you need to show this. You can't just tell people this. And to really, to really sit with my writing, that stayed with me and stays with me to this day. So I do think education is a big piece of it. There are, best practices, if you will, for this sort of thing. But also just having a course also flips your mind to it as an enterprise in a way that just the random walk through this landscape does not. So there's definitely importance to that. And that's why I think, I'm a big fan of liberal arts education for that reason, that, I trained in science, certainly. But, much of what made me a human was my humanistic training in literature and history and art and music and other things, which really changed the way I see the world around me and the way I communicate it.
So sticking with the theme of education, but switching now to talk about education in evolution. We've been talking about how important understanding evolution is for understanding what's happening today with the pandemic as it's playing out. And yet, evolution is not necessarily a course that, even most biology majors have to take, and certainly not something that all doctors or public health experts end up having to take. Is that problematic? Should we ensure that evolution is a part of the curriculum for folks going into these fields, or even more?
Oh, absolutely. Definitely. Darwin, just reading Darwin, Origin of Species is just, that was such a game-changing book for society. So if you think about evolution, not only as a scientific concept, but in terms of the history of science and the sociology of science and the making of our world, intellectually, Darwin's up there with Einstein, Adam Smith and other changers who wrote, other game changers who wrote books that, that affected the way we see the world. I think that's absolutely essential. I was fortunate in that, in high school, we all read The Origin of Species. Now, I was in high school at the time, so it didn't change my world. But then when I returned to it later, it wasn't just alien to me.
So we have a number of questions here in the Q&A about kind of what are some of the fossil discoveries that you're working on now? If there's something you can tell us about kind of what your current research efforts are. I know you've been in Antarctica recently. What are you looking for?
Yeah, so in Antarctica, we were there a year and a half ago, 2 years ago, and then a couple of years before, we did 2 field seasons there, looking at rocks a little bit older than those we found Tiktaalik in. We have a lot of great fossils from there. We're very excited in the lab because, and this was really sort of lucky pre-COVID lockdown last March, we did CT scanning of a number of blocks, just random blocks that we collected but had no real fossils on the surface. We did CT scanning of one and we found a little mini Tiktaalik, tiny little one, in the blocks. And it's not Tiktaalik, it's a new species. So we're excited about that. We're working on that's all in the CT scanning. That's one thing we're really excited about. My lab is also really working on a lot of molecular biology. We do quite a bit of DNA work. And one of the things we're really interested in lately is understanding the process of regeneration. That is, if you look at a salamander, and it's something I talk about in the Some Assembly Required, the new book, if you cut off one of their limbs, they grow back, the whole thing. And the bones, the muscles, the nerves, the arteries, it's there. I mean, and then if you do that to a lot of fish, the same thing, but we can't. So what's the difference genetically at the level of genes, the level of cells, and so forth? And we can apply an evolutionary approach to that because we know that it's not like salamanders gained regeneration. Regeneration was the ancestral state. We lost it, along with birds and some other creatures. And so, so we're using sort of that evolutionary framework to ask what is the genetic similarities and differences, you say, between our style of having a body and a salamander style of having a body, and what then enables them to regenerate. Whereas all we do is, we heal the wound, but we don't regrow a whole organ back. So we're into that right now. So yeah, it's an exciting time in the lab because, as you can see with, the vivid example here are the vaccines for, COVID-19. Then, in a year, we went from having the sequence of the virus to having vaccines, and even less than a year. I mean, it was a year to clinical trials being through and vaccines being manufactured even more. But we couldn't have done that without 10 years or even 20 of molecular biology breakthroughs in understanding how genes work and proteins are made. So, there was just so much game-changing science that happened in the last decade and a half or so that that enabled the breakthroughs of the vaccines we're seeing now. The same thing's true in my field. We have so much amazing molecular biology where we can see the genes that are active in making organs, and we can manipulate them with, CRISPR-Cas genome editing. And these are incredible times scientifically.
That certainly is exciting. Yeah. So something that you said made me think that, the idea that we lost at some point the ability to regenerate limbs. It seems like a perfect illustration of a common misconception in evolution, right? That evolution is always progress, and that evolution always sort of leads to better and better and better. I think most people would agree it'd be great if we could regenerate our limbs. Why did we give that up at some point? What other misconceptions are common when it comes to evolution? When you're interacting with people, I'm sure this comes up a lot. Like, what do people misunderstand, and what do you wish people would understand that they often don't when it comes to evolution?
Well, evolution is number one, evolution is not, so we opened with evolution is not some esoteric thing that you see in museums. It's something that's happening all around us. That's one very big thing. That evolution is still going on in many important ways, and we're living with the effects of it in everything we do. Right, and we are now a player in evolution. We're actually affecting the evolution of other organisms. That's a very big thing. The other is also this sort of equation of evolution and progress. That is somehow over time that there's organisms are better over time. Now they are better in their own environments, but in their local environments doesn't necessarily make them better across the board. We like to think we're the pinnacle of creation, but we should be so lucky that we should be so lucky to be salamanders. When we lose a limb, we can grow it all back. So the other creatures have capabilities that we do not have. Certainly, we have plenty of capabilities they don't have. But the evolution can go forward, can go backwards, can go sideways. There are so many different ways that evolution can act. And the other big thing is nothing in evolution begins when you think it does. If you think that feathers arose when creatures evolved to fly, and lungs arose when creatures evolved to walk on land, you'd be in really good company. You'd also be entirely wrong. Feathers evolved in dinosaurs before birds took their first flap, before birds started to fly. Lungs arose in fish before any creature walked on land. So the great inventions of the history of life always are more ancient than you can possibly imagine. They evolved in different settings. You're muted.
It was bound to happen eventually. Sorry about that.
The most common line of my year has been, Neil, you're muted. That's the one common line that since March 17th of last year.
It happens to all of us. I wanted to make sure I got to this question in the chat about what was your experience working with indigenous communities in, you mentioned in the Arctic, working with the Inuit people where Tiktaalik was discovered. Tell us a little bit about what that is like and what your experiences have been.
Yeah, that was a really important part of our work. So we started in 1998, and the idea was we are about 300 miles from the northernmost permanent human community in the world, and non-military. And so so Grise Fjord, Canada, is about 80 north latitude, which is about 300 miles from where we were. And so that village was very important to us because we would usually we'd work with the Hunter and Trappers organization. And the Hunter Trappers, so the village is about 175 people that live there year round. And so we work with the Hunter Trappers, and they would identify every year for our field season a youth, about 16 years old, who would join our expedition. So we had a member of the local indigenous community join us, usually a kid. And they were amazing. They were fun to work with. It was great. And they'd go back and they'd tell stories about us. And then when we eventually discovered Tiktaalik and we had to name it, the name Tiktaalik, we asked them to come up with a name for it. We described what the creature was, but we wanted a term in their language, and we wanted them to be involved in the naming of the creature. And so that's what they did. And that's what we're doing now with the school kids. They're coming with the name with the new fossil I told you about earlier. So no, it's really amazing. And we're continuing that work quite a bit. We worked with the local school a bit. It's kind of remarkable to, this community is not like something we encounter down south here. 175 people year round. It's dark for 6 months a year. It's light for 6 months a year. They're separated from other people by hours of plane rides. They have internet, and and much of their worldview is what you'd say very modern, if you will. But day to day, they have very limited interactions outside their own family groups and outside their own village. So the traditional hunts are very important to them. But also, I think, hopefully they take a little pride in their involvement in Tiktaalik and what they enabled us to do and us working with them to do.
We are just about out of time, but I just want to ask one final question here, and that is, given that we've been talking about how, some of the science related to evolution is sometimes considered controversial, there's certainly plenty of questionable or even misleading information out there about evolution. Where can people go if they want to make sure they're getting good information, specifically about evolution and the history of life? What are some places?
There's some just off the top. If you're on the web, just go to the University of California Museum of Paleontology at Berkeley. It has a fabulous website. It's called Understanding Evolution. And it's really set up for that. It's really set up to correct a lot of the myths out there, but also to give a resource for people, one-stop shopping resource for people to understand evolution, in a modern way. And they've been keeping it up. It's called Understanding Evolution. It's run by the University of California, Berkeley Museum of Paleontology. Google search will take you right there.
Perfect. That's great advice. Well, this has really been fantastic. On behalf of everyone in the course and everyone at the Baker Institute, I want to thank you, Dr. Shubin, for being our guest today, and thank those of you as well that contributed questions. I apologize that we didn't get to all of the questions, but this was a great conversation. And once again, Dr. Shubin, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. Take care.